Imagine a time when a Muslim scholar and a Christian monk could sit side by side, debating theology over steaming cups of tea, not as enemies, but as friends. Sounds impossible today? Yet, for centuries, this was not just possible, it was common. In our modern world, headlines often paint Islam and Christianity as locked in eternal conflict. But what if I told you that for hundreds of years, these two faiths didn't just coexist? They collaborated, inspired each other, and even saved each other's knowledge from extinction. This isn't a fantasy. It's history. And it's a story we've nearly forgotten. If you're tired of division and hungry for stories that reveal the hidden threads connecting humanity, hit subscribe and tap the bell. Because today, we're uncovering a bond so powerful, it once lit the torch of the Renaissance, and could light our path forward again. Picture this, the soft glow of oil lamps flickering against sandstone walls in the heart of Baghdad, 830 CE. Outside, the Tigris River hums a quiet lullaby as the city sleeps, but inside the House of Wisdom, the night is alive. Scrolls rustle. Quills scratch. Ink stains the fingers of men who speak different prayers but share the same hunger, to understand the mind of God through reason, beauty, and truth. Among them is a Christian physician named Hunayn ibn Ishaq, his eyes tired but bright, his hands steady as he translates Galen's medical treatises from Greek into flawless Arabic. Beside him sits a young Muslim scholar, al-Kindi, listening intently, asking questions not to challenge but to learn. There's no suspicion here. No fear. Only the quiet reverence of minds meeting across faiths, like stars aligning in a shared sky. This wasn't tolerance. It was kinship. And it was happening not in some utopian dream, but in the real, breathing heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Now, imagine the weight of what they were saving. While much of Europe lay shrouded in the so-called Dark Ages, where literacy was rare, libraries had crumbled, and Aristotle's name was little more than a whisper in monastic corridors, Baghdad was building a sanctuary for human thought. The Abbasid caliphs didn't just fund this project, they believed in it with their souls. Caliph al-Ma'mun, son of Harun al-Rashid, once had a dream in which Aristotle appeared to him and said, "The good is what reason approves." That vision became policy. He sent emissaries across the known world, Byzantium, Persia, India, to buy, borrow, or copy every ancient text they could find. And who did he trust to translate them? Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Muslims. Faith wasn't a barrier, it was a lens through which each could contribute their unique light. In this room, a Syriac-speaking monk and a Quran-reciting philosopher weren't enemies. They were colleagues, brothers in the pursuit of wisdom. Hunayn ibn Ishaq wasn't just translating words, he was stitching civilizations back together. Born in Al-Hira, a town long known for its Arab Christian communities, he grew up fluent in Syriac, Arabic, Greek, and Persian. When he traveled to Byzantium to collect manuscripts, he was welcomed not as a foreigner, but as a fellow heir to Hippocrates and Galen. Back in Baghdad, he didn't merely render Greek into Arabic, he refined, corrected, and expanded upon the originals, sometimes comparing 10 different versions of the same text to find the truest meaning. His translations weren't cold copies, they were acts of love. And because of him, Islamic medicine would soon leap centuries ahead. Hospitals in Baghdad would feature separate wards, licensed physicians, and even music therapy, all rooted in knowledge preserved by a Christian man working under Muslim patronage. Think about that, a faith often portrayed today as hostile to science was, in fact, its greatest protector, and it trusted a Christian to be its chief archivist. Now, let's journey west, to the sun-drenched hills of al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain. Here, in the 10th century, Cordoba wasn't just a city. It was a miracle. With over 500,000 residents, running water in homes, streetlights, and 70 public libraries, it dwarfed Paris and London combined. At its center stood the Great Mosque, a forest of red and white arches rising like prayer-made stone. But before it was a mosque, this sacred ground held a Visigothic church. And before that, a Roman temple. Each faith didn't erase the last. It honored it, built upon it, whispered to it in the quiet hours. Christians in Cordoba, known as Mozarabs, didn't hide their crosses. They wore them openly, sang hymns in Latin and Arabic, and served as diplomats, poets, and physicians in the caliph's court. One of them, Risamund, even co-authored an Arabic Christian calendar with a Muslim astronomer, blending feast days of Christ with lunar observations of the stars. Their children played together in courtyards scented with orange blossoms. Their scholars debated in a language that belonged to no one and everyone. And this wasn't forced coexistence. It was chosen harmony. When Abd al-Rahman III declared himself Caliph of Cordoba in 929, he didn't purge Christians. He appointed a Christian, Hasdai ibn Shaprat, as his foreign minister, a man who would later help negotiate peace between Christian kingdoms and the Caliphate. Churches stood beside mosques, not as rivals, but as neighbors. On holy nights, the call to prayer and the tolling of church bells would sometimes echo together over the Guadalquivir River, a duet of devotion. People didn't see contradiction in this. They saw complement. After all, both faiths bowed before the same God of Abraham. Both revered Mary, Maryam in Arabic, whose purity and strength were sung in both the Quran and the Gospels. A Christian mother in Toledo might name her daughter Fatima, out of respect. A Muslim poet might quote Jesus, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This wasn't syncretism. It was solidarity. And it flourished not in spite of faith, but because of it. In these moments, humanity rose above the noise of dogma and touched something sacred, the recognition that truth wears many faces, and that love for the divine can look different, and still be true. This is the world we lost. But more importantly, it's the world we once built together. And if we built it once, could we build it again? Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a cold stone cell in a 13th century monastery somewhere in the misty hills of France. A young friar named Thomas, quiet, intense, eyes burning with questions, kneels beside a flickering candle. Before him lies a manuscript, its pages brittle, its script foreign. It's not Latin, not Greek. It's Arabic. And in its margins, in careful Latin script, he scribbles notes that will one day shake the foundations of Christian theology. This young man is Thomas Aquinas. And the voice guiding his pen? Not an angel, but a Persian Muslim philosopher who died 2 centuries earlier, Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna. Without Avicenna's luminous commentaries on Aristotle, preserved, refined, and expanded in the libraries of Isfahan and Baghdad, Aquinas might never have reconciled faith with reason. His Summa Theologica, that towering cathedral of Christian thought, rests on intellectual pillars built by Muslim hands. Think of that. One of Christianity's greatest minds was shaped by the wisdom of Islam. Not in secret, not in shame, but in open, grateful dialogue. Theirs was a conversation across centuries, across deserts and seas, across the very boundaries we now treat as walls. And it wasn't just philosophy that flowed between them, it was healing. When a child fell ill in medieval Europe, the remedies prescribed often came from medical texts first written in Arabic, translated by Christian scholars in Muslim lands, and tested in hospitals where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish physicians worked side by side. In Cairo, the Al-Munksari Hospital treated thousands, rich and poor, believer and unbeliever, with wards for fevers, surgery, mental health, and even music therapy. Its founder, Sultan Kalawan, had once been healed by a Christian doctor during the Crusades. In gratitude, he built a hospital so grand it became a model for Europe. Compassion, it turns out, speaks every language. Now sail with me to Sicily, a jewel in the Mediterranean, where East and West didn't clash but danced. In the 12th century, under King Roger II, Palermo became a city of 3 tongues, Latin, Greek, and Arabic. His royal court shimmered with mosaics of Christ Pantocrator beside inscriptions in Kufic script. His maps, crafted by the Muslim geographer al-Idrisi, were so precise they remained the world's standard for 300 years. But here's what breaks the heart: al-Idrisi didn't work alone. Christian scribes copied his findings. Jewish astronomers verified his star charts. Together, they created the Tabula Rogeriana, a map not of conquest but of connection. It showed a world whole, not divided. And when Roger II died, his tomb bore an epitaph in all 3 languages, because his soul, like his kingdom, belonged to more than one world. Even in the shadow of war, the brutal, bloody era of the Crusades, humanity flickered like a stubborn flame. Yes, there were massacres. Yes, Jerusalem ran red. But beneath the armor and banners, ordinary people found ways to be human. In the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, Frankish knights drank coffee, a Muslim invention, bathed in hammams, and sent their children to be treated by Arab physicians. They wore silk robes, learned Arabic love poetry, and sometimes even married local women. These weren't traitors. They were people discovering that the enemy laughed like them, grieved like them, prayed for their children like them. And then there was Saladin, the Muslim sultan who retook Jerusalem in 1187. When the city fell, Europe braced for slaughter. Instead, Saladin opened the gates. He spared civilians. He allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He even paid the ransom for poor families who couldn't afford freedom. One chronicler wrote that when a Frankish woman came weeping, searching for her kidnapped child, Saladin wept with her, and ordered his men to find the boy. They did. And he returned him, wrapped in fine cloth, to her arms. This is not the Saladin of Hollywood. This is the Saladin of history, a man whose mercy became legend, even among those who called him foe. And perhaps the most tender moment of all happened not on a battlefield, but in a tent by the Nile. It was 1219. The Fifth Crusade was raging. Thousands were dying in the marshes of Damietta. Into this chaos walked a barefoot Italian friar, Francis of Assisi. No sword, no armor, just a tunic, a rope belt, and a heart cracked open by love. Against all warnings, he crossed enemy lines and asked to see Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil. The Sultan, weary of war, received him. 4 days they spoke, not to convert, not to conquer, but to understand. Francis spoke of Christ's peace. The Sultan spoke of the Prophet's compassion. They found more common ground than either expected. When Francis left, he carried no converts, but something far rarer, mutual respect. And the Sultan? He later told his court, if all Christians were like him, I would gladly become one. Back in Assisi, Francis never forgot that meeting. He began urging his friars to live among Muslims, not to preach but to serve, to love without condition. Centuries later, in the basilica that bears his name, a fresco quietly shows the two men embracing, Francis in brown robes, the Sultan in flowing silks. It's one of the few medieval images of peaceful interfaith encounter. A whisper from the past saying, it was possible. It is possible. In these stories, we don't just see history, we see ourselves. Not as enemies bound by ancient grudges, but as souls who have, again and again, reached across the divide and found a hand waiting. That hand was there in Baghdad's libraries, in Cordoba's courtyards, in Saladin's mercy, in Francis's courage. And if it was there then, why can't it be here now? Now, let us travel east, beyond deserts and mountains, into the storm-lashed courts of the Mongol Empire. The year is 1258. Baghdad, the radiant heart of the Islamic world, lies in ruins. The House of Wisdom is gone. Its books, thousands of them, are said to have turned the Tigris black with ink as they floated downstream. It feels like the end of everything. And yet, even in this hour of devastation, something astonishing happens. As the Mongol hordes sweep westward, threatening both Muslim caliphates and Christian kingdoms alike, a strange kinship begins to form, not in peace, but in shared survival. In Persia, the Ilkhanate rulers, descendants of Genghis Khan, initially worship the sky, then flirt with Buddhism, then slowly embrace Islam. But even after converting, they do not sever ties with the Christian world. Letters begin to cross the steppes, silk-wrapped scrolls from Persian Khans to the Pope in Rome, to kings in France, to monks in Armenia. They speak not only of war and alliance, but of faith, of dreams, of the stars that watch over us all. One Ilkhan ruler, Ghazan, builds mosques, but also protects churches. His vizier, Rashid al-Din, a Jewish convert to Islam, compiles a world history that gives equal reverence to prophets of Islam, Christ, and Moses. In the ashes of empire, a new kind of humanity is being stitched together, thread by fragile thread. And then, consider this quiet miracle. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where the air is thin and the mountains touch heaven, Christians and Muslims have lived as neighbors for over 14 centuries. Not in tolerance, but in tenderness. In the walled city of Hara, a Muslim family might prepare injera for their Orthodox Christian neighbors during Lent. A Christian elder might light a candle at a Muslim saint's shrine, asking for healing. When violence flares elsewhere in the world, Hara holds its breath, and holds its unity tighter. The Grand Mosque of Hara, built in the 10th century, stands just a stone's throw from the Church of St. Michael. Their bells and calls to prayer do not compete, they weave together like a sacred duet. During festivals, Muslims join Christians in processions, and Christians help decorate mosques for Eid. Why? Because they remember a story older than division, when the first followers of the Prophet Muhammad, fleeing persecution in Mecca, sailed across the Red Sea and found refuge with the Christian king Negus of Abyssinia. He didn't ask for their conversion. He offered them sanctuary. Go in peace, he told them. Your faith and mine are closer than you know. That promise echoes in every shared meal, every borrowed cup of sugar, every child who grows up calling his neighbor uncle regardless of creed. Now journey to the vast, sun-baked expanse of the Ottoman Empire, at its height, a mosaic of peoples stretching from Budapest to Baghdad. Here, the sultans did not demand uniformity. Instead, they built a system called the Millet, a word that means nation, but in practice meant sacred space. Under this covenant, Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, and Jews were not subjects to be controlled, but communities to be honored. They governed their own schools, married under their own laws, worshipped in their own tongues. The Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul wasn't a prisoner. He was a prince of his people, riding in a carriage granted by the Sultan himself. Churches that had been closed for centuries under Byzantine rule reopened under Ottoman protection. In fact, many Greek Christians later admitted they enjoyed more religious freedom under the Crescent than they ever had under the Cross. This wasn't perfect. No human system is. But it was profoundly humane. It said, your soul is yours. Your God is real to you. And that is enough. And then there's the story of Sultan Bayezid II, the man who looked at Europe's cruelty and chose compassion instead. The year is 1492. In Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand issue the Alhambra decree: all Jews must convert or leave. Tens of thousands are cast into the sea of exile, their homes seized, their children crying in the dust. As their ships drift, desperate and directionless, a fleet appears on the horizon, not to attack but to rescue. Sent by Bayezid, Ottoman ships gather the refugees like scattered pearls. You call Ferdinand a wise ruler? The Sultan reportedly scoffed to his court. He who impoverishes his own land to enrich mine? He welcomed the Jews not as beggars, but as scholars, doctors, and weavers. In cities like Salonika and Istanbul, Sephardic Jews rebuilt their lives, their synagogues rising beside mosques and churches. One rabbi wrote in his diary, "In Spain, we were ghosts. In Turkey, we became human again." That single act of mercy didn't just save lives. It preserved a culture, a language, a legacy that might have vanished forever. And it was done by a Muslim ruler whose name is barely remembered in the West, but whose kindness echoes in every Ladino song still sung today. Even in the quiet corners of daily life, beauty bloomed in the space between faiths. In 16th century Damascus, a Christian artisan might carve an icon of the Virgin Mary, and frame it with Arabic calligraphy quoting the Quran, and Mary, daughter of Imran, who guarded her chastity. We breathed into her of our spirit. In Cairo, Coptic priests and imams would sometimes share the same courtyard during festivals, sipping mint tea as children played tag between minarets and bell towers. In Anatolia, Sufi dervishes and Eastern Orthodox monks exchanged prayers, both seeking the same silence, the same union with the divine. These weren't grand treaties or royal decrees. They were small, sacred acts of recognition. I see your holiness. I honor your sorrow. Your joy is my joy. And in those moments, the walls we build between us and them didn't just crack, they dissolved like mist in morning light. This is the forgotten truth. Coexistence wasn't the exception. It was the rhythm of life for millions across centuries. Not because people were naive, but because they knew something we've forgotten, that faith at its core is not about borders. It's about belonging. And when we belong to something greater than ourselves, whether we call it God, Allah, or the light, we begin to see each other not as threats, but as fellow travelers on the same long road home. Let us now step into the quiet dignity of 17th century Morocco, a land of ochre walls, desert winds, and ancient Medinas where time moves like slow honey. Here, in the royal city of Meknes, Sultan Moulay Ismail sits not on a throne of conquest, but at a desk piled with letters. One of them comes from Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, ruler of Europe's most powerful Christian empire. You might expect threats, demands, declarations of war. Instead, the two monarchs exchange thoughts on justice, governance, and even theology. The Sultan, a devout Muslim known for his iron will, writes with startling humility, "We both serve the one God, though we name him differently. Let us seek peace, for the sake of our peoples who bleed the same." Louis, though steeped in absolutism, replies with respect. Their correspondence, preserved in dusty archives, reveals something astonishing. Even at the height of imperial rivalry, leaders could choose curiosity over contempt. They didn't agree on everything, but they refused to reduce each other to caricatures. In a world screaming enemy, they whispered neighbor. And in that whisper, a fragile bridge was built, one that reminds us that diplomacy at its best is an act of faith in shared humanity. Now, travel back in time to the cobblestone alleys of 19th century Beirut, where American missionaries arrived not with swords, but with Bibles and stethoscopes. They came to preach Christ, yes, but they also came to heal. And when cholera swept through the Levant, it was Muslim families who carried their sick children to the doors of Christian hospitals, trusting hands that prayed to a different name but worked with the same compassion. Dr. Cornelius van Dyck, a Presbyterian missionary, didn't just translate the Bible into Arabic. He helped revive the entire Arabic literary renaissance, al-Nahda. He collaborated with Muslim scholars to modernize education, print scientific texts, and establish schools where Christian and Muslim boys sat side by side, learning geometry, poetry, and ethics from the same books. In one such school in Mount Lebanon, a young Muslim student once asked his Christian teacher, "Do you think God hears my prayers?" The teacher knelt, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Son, God hears every heart that cries out in truth." That boy grew up to become a judge who protected Christian villages during times of unrest, because one act of kindness had planted a forest of grace in his soul. But perhaps the most hauntingly beautiful fusion of faith and art happened not in grand capitals, but in humble monasteries and village homes across the Middle East. For over 1,000 years, Arab Christians didn't just survive under Muslim rule. They thrived, creating a spiritual culture so interwoven with Islamic aesthetics that the line between them became a gentle blur. In 12th century Syria, a Melkite monk illuminated a gospel manuscript with gold leaf and lapis lazuli, and framed the Virgin Mary in intricate arabesques, her veil flowing like calligraphy, her halo echoing the geometry of a mosque's dome. In Egypt, Coptic churches began incorporating Quranic verses about Jesus and Mary into their liturgical chants, not as compromise, but as celebration of shared reverence. And in the homes of ordinary believers, you might find a Christian family reciting the Lord's Prayer in Arabic, their voices rising in the same melodic cadence as the adhan from the nearby minaret. Language became a bridge. Arabic, the language of the Quran, was also the sacred tongue of millions of Christians who saw no contradiction in loving Christ while speaking the words of the prophet's revelation. Their faith wasn't diluted. It was deepened, by living in a world where holiness wore many names, yet pointed to the same light. Consider this, in the Quran Maryam, Mary, is mentioned more times than in the entire New Testament. She is called chosen above all women, pure, devoutly obedient to God. An entire chapter, Surah Maryam, is named after her. And in it, the Quran recounts the Annunciation with poetic tenderness. "O Mary, indeed Allah gives you good tidings of a word from Him, whose name will be the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary." For centuries, Muslim and Christian mothers in the Levant would tell their children the same story of Mary's courage, her solitude, her trust in God. In Bethlehem, Muslim families still visit the Church of the Nativity during Christmas, not to convert, but to honor the birthplace of a prophet they revere. In Nazareth, Christian and Muslim women light candles together at the Well of Mary, whispering prayers for their children's safety. This isn't syncretism. It's solidarity of the soul. It's the quiet understanding that when two faiths love the same woman, the Mother of Mercy, they are already standing on holy ground together. And then, in a moment that feels almost miraculous, we arrive at the dawn of the printing press in the Ottoman Empire. When the technology finally reached Istanbul in the 18th century, many feared it would be used only for Islamic texts. But the first non-Muslim book ever printed in Arabic script within the empire was not a political tract or a scientific manual. It was a Christian psalter. And who funded it? A Muslim patron. Why? Because he believed that the words of David, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," were a gift to all who sought comfort, regardless of creed. That single volume, inked on fragile paper, carried within it a radical truth: sacred words do not belong to one people. They belong to the human heart. And when we share them, not to convert but to console, we become living libraries of grace. These stories are not footnotes. They are lifelines. They remind us that even in ages of empires and upheaval, ordinary people chose kindness over fear, curiosity over contempt, and beauty over division. And if they could do it then, amid plagues, wars, and uncertainty, what's stopping us now? Let us now step into the twilight of the 19th century, a time when the world began to fracture in ways we are still reckoning with today. In Morocco, Sultan Millet Hassan receives a delegation from a newly unified Italy. They speak of trade, of borders, of civilization. But beneath the polished words lies a new language, one of superiority, of us versus them, of faith reduced to flag. The Sultan listens quietly, then replies, "We do not measure a man by his creed, but by his character. And character is written in deeds, not dogma." His words hang in the air like incense, fragrant, ancient, and increasingly out of place. For across the globe, colonial powers are redrawing maps not with ink, but with blood, and in doing so, they are weaponizing religion. Christianity becomes a banner for conquest. Islam becomes a label for resistance. The rich, layered tapestry of coexistence, woven over 1,000 years, is suddenly torn apart and replaced with a crude cartoon of eternal enmity. The libraries of Baghdad, the courtyards of Cordoba, the shared festivals of horror, these are no longer celebrated as proof of human possibility. They are forgotten, erased, or worse, rewritten as myths. And yet, even as empires rise and fall, the quiet work of connection continues in the margins. In 1902, in the dusty town of Zol, Lebanon, a Muslim elder and a Maronite priest sit together under an olive tree after a season of tension. Their villages had nearly come to blows over a water dispute. But instead of calling for arms, they called for tea. For hours they speak, not as representatives of faiths, but as fathers, as widowers, as men who have buried friends. "My son," says the priest, "your mosque's minaret casts a shadow over my church at sunset. But that shadow doesn't darken my prayers. It reminds me that you too are calling on God." The elder places a hand on his shoulder. "And your bells," he replies, "they ring at dawn when I begin my far. I've come to love their sound. They tell me I'm not alone in rising to worship." That night, they draft a pact, signed by both communities, vowing to share the spring equally. No grand treaty. No international headlines. Just two men choosing humanity over history. And in that choice, the forgotten bond flickers back to life. But the 20th century brings storms unlike any before. World wars. Nationalism. The birth of new nations carved along religious lines. In India, in Palestine, in the Balkans, faith becomes a fault line. The old Ottoman Millet system, flawed but functional, is dismantled. In its place rises the modern nation-state, demanding singular identity: you are either this or that. The fluidity that once allowed a Christian to quote Rumi or a Muslim to light a candle for St. George is now seen as betrayal. Children are taught simplified stories: they did this to us. We suffered because of them. The nuance vanishes. The shared saints, the mutual reverence, the centuries of quiet coexistence, they fade into silence. And in that silence, fear grows louder. By the time we reach the digital age, algorithms feed us outrage, not understanding. A mosque burning in one country becomes justification for a church bombing in another. The voices of Saladin, Francis, Hunayn, and Bayezid are drowned out by the roar of division. We forget that the same hands that built cathedrals also copied Quranic verses. That the same hearts that wept at the crucifixion also bowed in awe at the night journey of the Prophet. And yet, listen closely, you can still hear it. The echo. In Cairo, a young Muslim woman volunteers at a Coptic hospital during a pandemic, holding the hand of an elderly Christian patient who has no family. In Sarajevo, a Catholic carpenter helps rebuild a mosque destroyed in the war, saying, "This minaret once called my grandfather to pause and pray, even if he crossed himself instead." In Dearborn, Michigan, an Iraqi Christian and a Syrian Muslim open a cafe together called Maryam and Maroon, serving dolma and baklava, playing feras and hymns, where customers argue politics but always leave as friends. These are not grand gestures. They are small rebellions against forgetting. Each one whispers the same truth: we were never meant to be enemies. The bond was not broken, it was buried. And every act of kindness across faith lines is a shovel, digging it back into the light. So here we stand, at the edge of a new century, haunted by the ghosts of division, yet still holding the keys to a different story. The forgotten bond between Islam and Christianity was never about erasing differences. It was about honoring them, while never letting them become walls. It was about recognizing that the same God who spoke to Moses on Sinai also whispered to Muhammad in a cave. That the same Spirit who descended on Jesus at the Jordan also guided Maryam in her solitude. For over 1,000 years, our ancestors didn't just tolerate each other, they needed each other. Muslim scholars needed Christian translators. Christian theologians needed Muslim philosophers. Jewish merchants carried both Quranic ink and gospel parchment across deserts. We were interwoven. And in that interweaving, civilization flourished. This is not nostalgia. It is invitation. An invitation to remember that the past is not a prison, it is a mirror. And in its reflection, we see not two warring faiths, but one human family. Stumbling, yes, but always reaching, always yearning, always capable of grace. So the next time someone tells you that Islam and Christianity are destined to clash, tell them about the monk and the sultan who wept together. Tell them about the libraries where faiths shared ink and breath. Tell them that love has always been stronger than doctrine, if only we have the courage to choose it. Because the bond was never truly forgotten. It's been waiting for us to remember.